My husband planned our dream wedding for 6 months, then didn't show up, so I married someone else. The invitation design took Daniel 3 weeks to finalize because he wanted the calligraphy to match the vintage aesthetic of the venue we'd chosen. He brought home 7 different paper samples and laid them across our kitchen table under the lamp, tilting each one to catch the light at different angles. I watched him study the textures with the kind of focus most people reserve for career decisions or medical diagnoses, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have someone who cared this much about getting everything perfect. He chose the cream-colored cotton paper with subtle flecks of gold, and when the proofs came back, he frowned at a barely visible alignment issue that I couldn't even see until he pointed it out with his finger. The printer fixed it, and Daniel smiled with genuine relief, like we'd just avoided some kind of disaster. Looking back, I should have recognized that obsession with control as a warning sign, but at the time, it just seemed like love. Daniel proposed on the anniversary of our first date at the same restaurant where we'd met 3 years earlier. He'd reserved the entire back room and filled it with photographs from our relationship displayed on easels like an art gallery. There were pictures of us hiking in Colorado, cooking dinner in our apartment, visiting his parents in Vermont, attending my sister's graduation. He got down on one knee in front of a timeline of our love story, and when I said yes, a violinist appeared from behind a curtain to play our song. The ring was my grandmother's diamond that he'd somehow convinced my mother to give him without me knowing. He'd thought of everything, planned every detail, orchestrated every moment to create something magical. My friends said they'd never seen a more romantic proposal, and I agreed completely. I spent the drive home with my hand on his leg, watching the ring catch streetlight through the car window, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. He kissed my forehead at every red light and told me he couldn't wait to spend forever with me. The wedding planning started the next day when Daniel presented me with a 3-ring binder he'd already assembled. Inside were dividers labeled with categories: venue, catering, flowers, music, photography, invitations, guest list, timeline. He'd printed out comparison spreadsheets for vendors with ratings, pricing tiers, and availability calendars. I opened the binder at our kitchen table while drinking coffee, slightly overwhelmed by how much work he'd already done. Daniel sat across from me explaining his research methodology, how he'd narrowed down options based on our budget and aesthetic preferences. He'd even created a shared digital calendar with deadlines color-coded by priority level. I laughed and told him he was incredible, and he reached across the table to squeeze my hand. He said he wanted this to be perfect for me, that I deserved the wedding of my dreams, and he was going to make sure every detail exceeded my expectations. I felt tears in my eyes because nobody had ever cared about making me happy the way Daniel did. We visited 7 venues before Daniel selected the historic mansion overlooking the river. The ballroom had floor-to-ceiling windows, original hardwood floors, and a terrace where guests could watch the sunset during cocktail hour. The venue coordinator, Patricia, showed us the space and discussed package options while Daniel took notes on his tablet. I fell in love with the place immediately, but Daniel wanted to see the other 6 venues on his list before making a decision. We spent 3 Saturdays touring properties, and each time I mentioned liking something, Daniel would nod thoughtfully and make notes but never commit. When we finally circled back to the Riverside mansion, he agreed it was the best choice and put down the deposit that same afternoon. Patricia seemed impressed by his organizational skills and said most grooms weren't this involved in the planning process. Daniel told her he wasn't most grooms, and he had very specific ideas about how he wanted our day to unfold. On the drive home, I thanked him for being so invested, and he said planning this wedding was his way of showing me how much I meant to him. The guest list became our first real disagreement about the wedding. I wanted to invite my college roommate Stephanie and her husband, but Daniel said we'd agreed on keeping the wedding intimate at 80 guests maximum. I pointed out that his side already had 42 people confirmed while mine only had 31, which meant I had room for 7 more. Daniel pulled up his spreadsheet and showed me how adding any guests would throw off the seating chart he'd already designed. Each table seated 10 people, and he'd carefully arranged groups based on relationships and dynamics to ensure good conversation flow. Adding Stephanie and her husband would create an uneven table or force him to reconfigure multiple arrangements. I suggested we could just add another table, but Daniel explained that the ballroom layout was optimized for 8 tables, and 9 would look awkward in the space. We went back and forth for an hour before I finally dropped it because he seemed so stressed about the logistics. He apologized for being difficult and said he just wanted everything to be perfect, and I told him I understood even though I felt disappointed about Stephanie. Daniel hired a wedding planner named Vivian, who came highly recommended by Patricia. Vivian arrived at our apartment for the first consultation with her own binder, and a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. She asked about our vision, and before I could answer, Daniel launched into a detailed description of the aesthetic he wanted. Romantic vintage elegance with modern touches, a color palette of dusty rose and sage green with gold accents, garden-inspired florals with lots of texture, Edison bulb string lights for ambiance. Vivian typed rapidly on her laptop while he talked, occasionally asking clarification questions about specific elements. When she finally turned to me and asked what I wanted, I said Daniel had pretty much covered it, and she laughed like I'd made a joke. She said most couples had different visions that needed to be merged, but we seemed unusually aligned. Daniel reached over and took my hand, and I smiled because it was easier than admitting I hadn't thought about Edison bulbs or texture in florals. Vivian said she'd put together some mood boards based on Daniel's description and we'd review them at our next meeting. The next 3 months blurred together in a series of vendor meetings, tastings, and fittings. Daniel attended every single appointment with detailed questions prepared in advance. At the cake tasting, he asked the baker about structural integrity of different tier configurations and whether buttercream would hold up better than fondant in warm weather. At the florist, he brought photographs of specific flower varieties he wanted included in my bouquet and discussed the symbolic meaning of each one. At the photographer's studio, he requested to see full wedding galleries, not just highlight reels, because he wanted to assess consistency across an entire event. Every vendor seemed slightly taken aback by his level of involvement, but they all took him seriously because he clearly knew what he was talking about. I mostly nodded along and agreed with his choices because he'd done so much research that arguing seemed pointless. My mother asked during one of our phone calls if I was actually getting any input into my own wedding, and I told her Daniel was just excited and I trusted his taste completely. My dress shopping happened on a Saturday with my mother, my sister Claire, and my best friend Morgan. We'd made appointments at 3 boutiques, and I was excited to finally focus on something that was just mine. The first store had dozens of beautiful options, and I tried on 6 different styles while my entourage sat on the viewing platform offering opinions. I found a fitted lace gown with an open back that made me feel beautiful, and when I stepped out of the dressing room, Claire actually gasped. My mother started crying, and Morgan said it was the one. But when I sent a photo to Daniel, he responded that he wasn't sure about the open back because it didn't fit the vintage romantic aesthetic we'd discussed. He said we should keep looking. I tried on 8 more dresses at the other boutiques, but none of them felt as right as the first one. When I mentioned this to Daniel that evening, he pulled up the venue photos and showed me how the open back style would clash with the classic architecture. He said he wanted people to focus on my face, not my exposed skin, and didn't I want to look timeless in our photos? I agreed to keep searching, even though something felt wrong about letting him veto my dress choice. The second dress shopping trip happened 3 weeks later, this time with Daniel coming along despite my protests that it was bad luck for the groom to see the dress. He said that was superstitious nonsense, and he wanted to make sure I found something that would photograph well and complement the overall aesthetic. The consultant at the boutique seemed confused when Daniel started explaining what he was looking for before I even tried anything on. He described a vintage-inspired silhouette with long sleeves, a modest neckline, and a chapel train. The consultant pulled several options, and I tried them on while Daniel sat in the viewing area evaluating each one. When I came out in a beautiful A-line gown with delicate sleeves and pearl detailing, he smiled wider than I'd seen in weeks. He stood up and walked around me in a circle, examining the dress from every angle. He said it was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Exactly what he'd envisioned for me. The consultant asked what I thought, and I looked at myself in the mirror, seeing a dress that was pretty, but didn't make me feel anything. I said it was nice, and Daniel corrected me that it was more than nice. It was the one. My mother wasn't there to offer her opinion, and I found myself nodding agreement because Daniel seemed so happy. The wedding website went live 4 months before the ceremony, and Daniel had built it himself using a design template he'd customized. The homepage featured our engagement photos with a countdown timer and tabs for schedule, accommodations, registry, and RSVP. He'd written the Our Story section in a romantic narrative style that made our relationship sound like a fairy tale. Reading it, I barely recognized some of the anecdotes he'd included because he'd embellished details or remembered things differently than I did. There was a story about how I'd supposedly chased after him at the restaurant on our first date because I didn't want him to leave without my number, which wasn't accurate because he'd actually asked for my number before the check came. When I mentioned the discrepancy, Daniel said he'd taken creative license to make the story more romantic, and it didn't really matter what the exact sequence was. He asked me to proofread the entire site for typos, and I did, but I didn't push back on the narrative inaccuracies because they seemed harmless enough. Morgan called me after seeing the website and said Daniel had really outdone himself, then asked quietly if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just stressed about all the planning, and she said to call her if I ever needed to talk. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for the evening before the wedding at a private room in the same restaurant where Daniel had proposed. He'd planned the menu, selected the wine pairings, and created a seating chart for the 40-person dinner. My father was supposed to give a toast, followed by Daniel's best man Trevor, and then Daniel wanted to show a video montage he'd been working on for months. The week before the dinner, Daniel showed me a rough cut of the video on his laptop. It was 15 minutes long with photos and video clips from our relationship set to music with text overlays describing different chapters of our story. The production quality was impressive, but watching it felt strange because the narrative arc positioned Daniel as the hero who'd rescued me from a directionless life. There were captions like, "Before Daniel, Amber didn't know what she wanted," and "Daniel showed Amber what true love looks like." I paused the video and asked him why he'd written it that way, and he seemed genuinely confused by my question. He said he was just being romantic and showing how we'd grown together, and wasn't that what love stories were about? I didn't know how to explain that it felt like he'd erased my entire personality to fit his narrative. 2 months before the wedding, I started having dreams about running away. In the dreams, I'd be getting ready in the bridal suite, and suddenly I'd walk out through a side door and just keep walking until I reached the highway. I'd wake up with my heart racing, and Daniel would be sleeping peacefully next to me, and I'd feel guilty for even subconsciously thinking about leaving. I never told anyone about the dreams because they seemed like a betrayal of everything we were building together. Daniel had spent thousands of hours planning this perfect day, and I was having anxiety dreams about abandoning him at the altar. I convinced myself it was just normal pre-wedding jitters that every bride experienced. My therapist, Dr. Reeves, asked during one session how I was feeling about the upcoming wedding, and I gave her the standard answer about being excited but nervous. She looked at me for a long moment and asked if the nervousness was about the wedding or the marriage, and I changed the subject to work stress instead. Looking back, I realized she was trying to give me an opening to admit something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. 3 weeks before the wedding, Daniel's behavior shifted into what I can only describe as frantic mode. He called vendors multiple times daily to confirm details that had already been confirmed. He created backup plans for his backup plans, printing out contingency protocols for various disaster scenarios like bad weather, vendor cancellations, or technical failures. He started sleeping poorly, waking up at 3 in the morning to add items to his wedding day timeline. The timeline itself had become a minute-by-minute schedule spanning 20 pages, with specific assignments for different members of the wedding party. I found him in our home office one night at 2 in the morning, and when I asked what he was doing, he said he was optimizing the cocktail hour flow to prevent bottlenecks at the bar. I suggested he needed sleep more than he needed to optimize anything, and he snapped that I didn't understand how much pressure he was under to make sure everything was perfect. I apologized and went back to bed alone, feeling like I'd done something wrong by interrupting his planning session. The next morning, he apologized for being short with me and blamed the stress. And I accepted his apology because what else was I supposed to do 3 weeks before our wedding? My final dress fitting was 10 days before the ceremony, and when I put on the gown, it didn't fit right anymore. I'd lost weight from stress, and the bodice was loose in places it should have been snug. The seamstress pinned the areas that needed to be taken in and said she could have it ready in time, but she'd need to charge a rush fee for the alterations. I took photos of myself in the mirror to send to Daniel, then decided not to because I didn't want to add another thing to his stress list. Claire came with me to the fitting and told me I looked beautiful, but I could tell she was concerned about something. On the drive home, she asked if I was happy, and I told her of course I was happy. I was marrying the man I loved. She said that wasn't what she'd asked, and I let the question hang in the air between us unanswered. When she dropped me off at my apartment, she hugged me longer than usual and told me that if I ever needed anything, day or night, I should call her. I went inside and found Daniel reviewing his timeline document for the 100th time, and I didn't mention the dress alterations or Claire's question because some part of me knew I couldn't handle his response right then. The week before the wedding, my office threw me a small celebration during lunch. My coworkers had decorated the conference room and ordered a cake, and everyone wanted to hear about the wedding plans. I found myself describing Daniel's incredible attention to detail, the beautiful venue, the carefully curated aesthetic, and they all seemed impressed and slightly envious. My boss Linda asked if I was ready to be married, and I laughed and said I was ready for the planning to be over so we could just enjoy being married. Linda nodded, but her expression suggested she'd picked up on something I hadn't said out loud. After everyone went back to their desks, she stopped by my office and said that if I ever needed to talk about anything, her door was always open. I thanked her and wondered why everyone kept offering me these vague support statements like they could sense something I was still refusing to acknowledge. That night, Daniel stayed late at his office working on the video montage, and I sat alone in our apartment thinking about how many people had essentially asked if I was okay in the past few weeks. I poured a glass of wine and tried to ignore the voice in my head, asking why I couldn't just admit that something was deeply wrong. 4 days before the wedding, Daniel's parents arrived from Vermont. His mother, Diane, immediately wanted to review all the wedding details, and Daniel spent 3 hours walking her through his planning binder, while his father, Richard, sat quietly reading the newspaper. Diane had opinions about everything from the flower arrangements to the font on the programs, and Daniel defended each choice with increasing frustration. When she suggested that perhaps they should have real candles instead of LED candles for safety reasons, Daniel explained in excruciating detail why LED candles were the better choice for the venue's insurance requirements and aesthetic consistency. Diane finally held up her hands in surrender and said she was just trying to help. Daniel apologized for being defensive and blamed the stress, and Diane hugged him and told him everything was going to be perfect. Richard caught my eye from across the room and gave me a sympathetic look that suggested he'd seen Daniel get like this before. Later that evening, Richard pulled me aside on the balcony and asked how I was holding up with all the planning chaos. I told him I was fine, and he said that was good. But marriage was a big commitment, and it was okay to have doubts. I assured him I didn't have doubts, and he nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe me, but wasn't going to push further. The rehearsal happened the night before the wedding, and everyone gathered at the venue at 6 o'clock. Patricia walked us through the ceremony processional, explaining where people should stand and when they should move. Daniel had created a separate timeline document specifically for the rehearsal and kept interrupting Patricia to clarify details that seemed obvious to everyone else. The bridesmaids stood in their assigned positions while Daniel adjusted their spacing by inches, moving them slightly left or right until he was satisfied with the visual balance. Claire whispered to Morgan that this was the weirdest rehearsal she'd ever attended, and I pretended not to hear. When it came time for me to practice walking down the aisle, Daniel stopped me 3 times to adjust my pace because I was apparently walking too fast. He wanted me to take exactly 4 seconds between each step, and he counted out loud while I walked, making me restart when I deviated from his specified timing. My father stood at the end of the aisle looking increasingly uncomfortable, and when we finally completed a practice run that Daniel approved, my father asked if we could please move on to the dinner portion of the evening. Daniel agreed, but first wanted to run through the recessional one more time to make sure everyone understood the exit order. The rehearsal dinner started an hour late because Daniel's rehearsal had run over schedule. The restaurant staff looked annoyed but professional as they served the first course while Daniel stood up to welcome everyone. He thanked people for coming and talked about how much this wedding meant to him, how he'd poured his heart into planning every detail because he wanted to create something unforgettable. He talked for 15 minutes about his planning process, the decisions he'd made, the vision he'd developed. He barely mentioned me except to say that he was doing all of this for me because I deserved the perfect day. My father gave his toast next, and it was warm and funny and included stories about my childhood that made everyone laugh. Trevor's best man toast was full of anecdotes about Daniel's obsessive personality and how he'd apparently been planning his wedding since college, long before he'd met me. Everyone laughed, but I felt a chill run through me because the stories made Daniel sound controlling and rigid. Then Daniel started the video montage, and I watched 15 minutes of our relationship reduced to a narrative where I'd been a supporting character in Daniel's love story. When the video ended, everyone applauded, but I excused myself to go to the bathroom and ended up sitting on the closed toilet lid trying to breathe normally. Morgan found me in the bathroom 10 minutes later and knocked on the stall door. I let her in, and she immediately asked what was wrong, and I told her I couldn't do this. The words came out before I could stop them, and once I started talking, I couldn't stop. I told her about the dress he'd vetoed, the guest list arguments, the minute-by-minute timeline, the video that made me feel erased, the constant feeling that this wedding was about Daniel's vision rather than our partnership. Morgan listened without interrupting, and when I finally stopped talking, she said she'd been worried about me for months, but didn't know how to bring it up. She said that, from an outside perspective, Daniel seemed more interested in executing his perfect wedding than in marrying me specifically. I started crying, and Morgan hugged me while I soaked her dress with tears. She asked what I wanted to do, and I said I didn't know because the wedding was tomorrow and everyone was already here, and Daniel had spent 6 months planning everything. Morgan said that was all true, but none of it mattered if I didn't actually want to marry him. She asked me directly, did I want to marry Daniel? I opened my mouth to say yes automatically, and nothing came out because I'd finally hit the truth I'd been avoiding for months. I went back to my apartment that night instead of staying at the hotel with the bridesmaids like we'd planned. Daniel had stayed at his parents' hotel room to preserve the tradition of not seeing each other before the ceremony, which meant I had the place to myself. I sat on the couch in my rehearsal dinner dress and stared at my phone, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me thought I was just having last-minute jitters that would pass by morning, but another part of me, the part that had been growing louder for months, knew that marrying Daniel would be a mistake. He wasn't a bad person. He'd never been cruel or abusive, but somewhere in the 6 months of wedding planning, I'd realized that he was in love with the idea of marriage more than he was in love with me. He'd built this elaborate fantasy of his perfect wedding, and I'd been cast in the role of his bride, but the actual person I was didn't seem to matter to him. I called Dr. Reeves's emergency line at 11 o'clock, and she called me back 20 minutes later. I told her everything in a rush of words, and she listened, and then asked me what I would do if there were no wedding, no guests, no plans, no expectations. If it was just me and Daniel, would I want to marry him? I said no, and hearing myself say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch watching the hours pass on the clock, trying to figure out how to handle what was about to happen. At 6 in the morning, my phone started buzzing with texts from the bridesmaids asking where I was because hair and makeup were starting at 7. I texted back that I'd be there soon, then sat for another 30 minutes unable to move. Finally, at 6:45, I called my father and told him I needed to talk to him before I came to the hotel. He must have heard something in my voice because he just said okay and gave me his room number. I drove to the hotel in yesterday's dress and went straight to his room, and when he opened the door, I said I couldn't marry Daniel. My father's face went through several expressions before settling on understanding, and he pulled me into a hug and said, okay, we'd figure this out. He didn't ask why or try to talk me into going through with it or mention the money or the guests or any of the logical reasons I should proceed. He just accepted my decision and asked what I needed from him. I told him I needed him to tell Daniel because I couldn't face having that conversation, and my father said he would handle it. My father called Daniel at 7:30 while I sat on the hotel room bed listening to his side of the conversation. He started by saying there was a situation, and Daniel needed to stay calm. Then he said that I wasn't going to be able to go through with the wedding and he was very sorry, but that was the decision I'd made. There was a long silence while Daniel apparently responded. and my father's expression shifted to something like pity. He said he understood Daniel had put a lot of work into planning the wedding, but I wasn't in the right headspace to get married and forcing it would be a mistake. More silence. Then my father said firmly that he wasn't going to let me talk to Daniel right now because I'd made my decision and I needed space. Daniel was apparently yelling because I could hear his voice coming through the phone, and my father held the phone away from his ear. When Daniel finally stopped, my father said he was sorry this was happening and he'd make sure to help handle the vendor cancellations and guest notifications. Then he hung up and looked at me and said it was done. I started crying so hard I thought I might throw up, and my father sat next to me rubbing my back until I could breathe normally again. The next hour was chaos as my father made calls to Patricia, Vivian, and the vendors to cancel everything. My mother showed up at the room after my father called her, and she held me while I cried and told her I was sorry for wasting everyone's time and money. She said I hadn't wasted anything, and she was proud of me for being honest with myself before making a permanent mistake. Claire and Morgan arrived next, and they sat on either side of me on the bed while I explained what had happened. They both said they'd suspected something was wrong and they were relieved I'd called it off. Morgan said she'd go down to the lobby and start telling guests that the wedding was canceled so people didn't show up at the venue unnecessarily. My mother said she'd handle calling Daniel's parents to explain the situation. My father continued working through the vendor list, and I heard him leaving voicemails explaining that the wedding was canceled due to unforeseen circumstances and requesting information about refund policies. Everyone moved with purpose while I sat frozen in the center of the chaos I'd created, unable to do anything except try to process the fact that I'd just called off my wedding 5 hours before it was supposed to start. Daniel showed up at the hotel at 9:30 with Trevor trying unsuccessfully to restrain him. He pounded on my father's door demanding to talk to me, and my father stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. I could hear Daniel shouting that he'd spent 6 months planning this wedding, that he'd put his heart into making it perfect, that he'd done everything for me and I was throwing it away for no reason. My father's voice was calm but firm as he said that I had very good reasons and Daniel needed to respect my decision and leave. Daniel said he wasn't leaving until I explained myself, and Trevor's voice joined in trying to convince him to go cool down. The argument went on for several minutes before hotel security apparently got involved, and I heard Daniel being told he needed to vacate the premises or they'd call the police. Trevor apologized to my father and promised he'd get Daniel out of there, and then it went quiet in the hallway. My mother hugged me and said I'd done the right thing, but I felt like the worst person in the world for humiliating Daniel in front of everyone who'd traveled to celebrate our wedding. I stayed in the hotel room until checkout time at 11. Then my father drove me back to my apartment. When we pulled into the parking lot, I saw Daniel's car and told my father I couldn't go inside. He said Daniel wasn't allowed to be there if I didn't want him there, and he called the police non-emergency line to request an officer come supervise while I retrieved my things. A police officer arrived 20 minutes later, and we all went up to the apartment together. Daniel was sitting on the couch surrounded by printed copies of his wedding timeline, and when he saw me, he stood up and started asking why I'd done this to him. The officer stepped between us and told Daniel he needed to remain calm or he'd have to leave. I grabbed a suitcase and started throwing clothes into it while Daniel followed me from room to room asking what he'd done wrong, what he could fix, how we could salvage this. I told him it wasn't about fixing anything. It was about the fundamental fact that he'd planned his dream wedding without caring about what I actually wanted. Daniel said that was crazy because he'd done everything for me, and I turned around and asked him to name one decision I'd made about the wedding. He opened his mouth and closed it and couldn't answer, and I saw the realization dawn on his face that he actually couldn't think of anything. I moved in with Claire temporarily because I couldn't afford our apartment on my own, and Daniel legally had as much right to be there as I did. Morgan came over the first night with wine and takeout, and we sat on Claire's couch while I ugly cried and ate sesame chicken and tried to process what I'd just done. My phone was blowing up with messages from people asking what had happened, and I turned it off because I couldn't handle explaining the situation over and over. Morgan said people would understand eventually, and if they didn't, they weren't people I needed in my life anyway. Claire said I could stay as long as I needed, and she was proud of me for choosing myself. But I didn't feel proud. I felt guilty and ashamed and terrified that I'd made a huge mistake by walking away from someone who loved me enough to plan the perfect wedding. Dr. Reeves called that evening to check on me, and I told her I felt like I'd destroyed everything. She said sometimes we have to destroy something that looks perfect on the surface to build something real underneath, and that truth was more valuable than perfection. Her words helped, but they didn't take away the crushing weight of knowing I'd hurt someone who'd spent half a year trying to make me happy. The texts from Daniel started the next day and didn't stop for weeks. At first, they were apologetic and desperate, saying he understood he'd been controlling and he could change if I gave him another chance. Then they shifted to angry, accusing me of leading him on and wasting his time and humiliating him in front of everyone he knew. Then they became nostalgic, sharing memories of good times we'd had together and asking how I could throw away 3 years over wedding planning disagreements. I didn't respond to any of them because my therapist advised me not to engage, but I read every single one and felt guilty each time. My mother suggested I block his number, but I couldn't bring myself to do it because that felt too final. Trevor reached out after 2 weeks and asked if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed because I owed Daniel's friends some kind of explanation. We met at a neutral location, and Trevor said he understood why I'd called off the wedding and he didn't blame me. He said he'd watched Daniel become obsessed with the planning and lose sight of the actual relationship, and he'd tried to talk to Daniel about it, but Daniel hadn't listened. Trevor said Daniel was devastated but would eventually be okay, and I shouldn't feel guilty for being honest about my feelings. Hearing that from Daniel's best friend helped more than I'd expected. 3 weeks after the canceled wedding, I was back at work trying to pretend everything was normal when Linda stopped by my desk. She said there was someone in the conference room asking to talk to me, and when I walked in, I found Daniel's mother, Diane, sitting there with tea. My first instinct was to leave, but something about her expression made me sit down instead. Diane apologized for coming to my workplace and said she wouldn't take much of my time. She said she'd spent the past few weeks thinking about the wedding and her son's behavior, and she wanted me to know that she didn't blame me for calling it off. She said she'd raised Daniel to believe that if he planned and controlled everything perfectly, life would work out exactly as he wanted. She'd reinforced that worldview by praising his organizational skills and his attention to detail, without teaching him that other people's feelings and desires mattered just as much as his plans. She said watching him plan the wedding had been like watching him build an elaborate structure with no foundation, and she'd known it was going to collapse but hadn't intervened. She asked if I could forgive her for not saying something sooner, and I found myself crying and saying there was nothing to forgive. Diane hugged me and said she hoped I'd find someone who loved me for who I was rather than who they wanted me to be. I started dating again 4 months later, which felt both too soon and overdue. My coworker's brother Nathan asked me out after meeting me at a company happy hour, and I said yes, mostly because I needed to prove to myself that I could. Our first date was casual and low pressure at a brewery where we talked about our jobs and our families and our favorite shows. Nathan was easy to talk to in a way Daniel had never been. He asked questions and seemed genuinely interested in my answers, rather than waiting for his turn to talk. When he asked about my interests and hobbies, I realized I didn't know how to answer, because I'd spent 3 years molding myself to fit Daniel's preferences. Nathan suggested we make it our project to figure out what I actually liked, and over the next few weeks we tried different activities: painting classes, hiking trails, cooking experiments, live music venues. I discovered I loved things I'd never known about myself because Daniel had never bothered to ask or explore with me. Nathan had no agenda except spending time with me and learning who I was, and the simplicity of that felt revolutionary. 6 months after the canceled wedding, Nathan and I were serious enough that meeting families became relevant. I was terrified to introduce him to my parents because I thought they'd judge me for moving on so quickly, but my mother hugged Nathan and thanked him for making me laugh again. My father took Nathan aside and gave him some kind of speech that Nathan later characterized as sweet, but slightly threatening, and Nathan promised he had no intention of hurting me. Meeting Nathan's family was easier because they didn't have the context of my failed engagement and just treated me like any girlfriend their son had brought home. His sister Alexis pulled me aside at dinner and said Nathan talked about me constantly, and she'd never seen him this happy, and I felt a warmth in my chest that I'd never felt with Daniel. On the drive home, Nathan asked if I'd ever want to get married again someday. Not to him specifically necessarily, just in general. I said I thought I would if it was with the right person, and he nodded and said he hoped he might be that person eventually. The casualness of it, the lack of pressure, the acknowledgement that we were building something together rather than executing someone's predetermined vision made me realize what had been missing with Daniel. Nathan proposed 14 months after our first date on a random Tuesday evening while we were cooking dinner together. There was no elaborate setup, no photographer hiding in the bushes, no scripted speech. He just turned from the stove where he was making pasta and said he loved me more than he'd ever loved anyone, and he wanted to spend his life with me if I wanted that too. The ring was simple and beautiful, and when I said yes, we just stood in the kitchen hugging and crying and laughing at how unplanned the whole thing was. Later that evening, Nathan said he wanted to make something clear about the wedding planning. He had exactly 2 requests, which were that his grandmother could attend and there would be good food. Everything else was up to me to decide, and he'd be happy with whatever I wanted because he was marrying me, not producing an event. I asked what his vision was for the wedding, and he said his vision was getting to call me his wife at the end of the day, and everything else was just details. The relief I felt hearing those words made me realize how much trauma I'd been carrying from Daniel's approach to our relationship. We planned our wedding in 6 weeks because neither of us wanted a long engagement or an elaborate production. I chose a small venue that held 50 people, picked wildflowers for bouquets that we arranged ourselves the morning of the ceremony, wore a simple dress I found on sale, and asked Claire to make the cake because she loved baking. Nathan's only additions were hiring a guitarist he knew from college and making a playlist of our favorite songs for the reception. We wrote our own vows the night before the wedding while sitting on the couch drinking wine, and they were honest and imperfect and real. The morning of the wedding, I woke up without anxiety or dread, just excitement to marry someone who saw me as a whole person rather than a character in his fantasy. My mother helped me get ready and told me that this, right here, was what happiness looked like. When I walked down the aisle toward Nathan, he was crying and smiling, and when we said our vows, we both meant every word. The reception was chaotic and imperfect, with a cake that leaned slightly to one side and a sound system that cut out twice. And none of it mattered because we were surrounded by people we loved who were celebrating us, not some carefully curated aesthetic. Claire stood up during the toasts and told a story about the morning I'd called off my first wedding, how she'd been terrified for me but also proud of me for choosing truth over comfort. She said that watching me with Nathan had taught her what real partnership looked like, and she was grateful I'd found someone who loved me without trying to control me. Morgan's toast was about how she'd watched me disappear into Daniel's vision for my life and then slowly come back to myself with Nathan. She said that loving someone meant wanting them to be fully themselves, not a carefully edited version that fit your preferences. My father's toast was short and emotional, saying he'd always known I deserved better than someone who treated love like a project to be managed. And Nathan's toast to me was simply that he felt like the luckiest person alive to have found someone brave enough to start over when something wasn't right. We danced until our feet hurt, and ate cake with our hands, and laughed until our faces hurt, and it was perfect precisely because it wasn't perfect at all. 2 years later, Daniel sent me a message through LinkedIn because I'd blocked him everywhere else. He said he'd been in therapy working on his control issues, and he wanted to apologize for how he'd treated me during our relationship. He said he'd viewed our wedding as a reflection of himself rather than a celebration of us, and he understood why I'd walked away. He said he hoped I was happy and that he'd learned from his mistakes with me. I showed the message to Nathan, and he asked if I wanted to respond. I thought about it for a while and decided that some chapters need to close completely without a final conversation. Daniel's apology was for him, not for me, and I didn't owe him closure or forgiveness or acknowledgement. I was happy with Nathan in a way that had nothing to do with Daniel or the wedding I'd walked away from. Sometimes the best response is moving forward without looking back, building a life that's real instead of perfect, choosing partnership over perfection. I closed the LinkedIn message without responding and went to find Nathan, who was outside gardening and humming off-key to himself. He looked up when he heard me and smiled, and I thought about how grateful I was that I'd been brave enough to walk away from the wrong person so I could find the right one. The wedding I didn't have mattered less than the marriage I did, and that was the only truth that counted. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.